Welcome to part 2 of the videos that I'm making about philosophy in Overwatch. If you haven't already watched part 1, I recommend doing that first. This video is going to assume that we're on the same page about what was discussed in that one, so if you do watch this one first, fair warning, some things might be referencing that one. That last video was the broad strokes about the topic and covered most of the organizations within the Overwatch universe, and this one's going to go through the entire roster of heroes and try to explain their philosophies. If you're wondering why this is a two-part thing, it's because there are about 50 heroes and organizations to talk about. I don't actually want to put out one single hour-long plus video on the topic because I don't think anyone would click on it. Also, just as a heads up, not every hero has some incredibly interesting philosophical stance that we can really dive into. Some of these people either have very simple motivations, have not had their motivations fully explored enough to make a definitive statement about their philosophy, or they don't really have enough agency to really have a philosophy of their own. I'll do my best to say something about everyone, but if it looks like I'm playing favorites and talking about some heroes more than others, it's because some of them are just more interesting from a philosophical stance. A lot of the heroes also share some degree of their worldview. While there are a lot of philosophical schools, there are definitely some that are more common than others, both in the world of Overwatch and in the real world. Like, there are a lot of ends justify the means type of people out there, and not as many rigid adherents of cyberfeminism in the Overwatch roster. Overwatch also isn't really trying to do the deep dive into ideological visions and philosophical worldviews that other games sometimes do, so their characters are going to generally have philosophies that ground them in pretty basic worldviews. I'm going to try and find more interesting things to say about their philosophies where I can, but please don't get mad at me if you notice that I'm describing a roster full of mercenaries and private military officers as ethical egoists and or utilitarians. Also, in spite of my status as an unemployed person offering his unasked for opinions to the public, I am not actually a philosopher, and I'm also going to assume you don't have a master's in philosophy either. This is going to be some philosophy for dummies level stuff, and it's going to be covering nearly 40 characters, so please allow me some grace if I don't cover every nuance of every single character in this 40 to 50 minute video. For this video, characters are going to be broken down into 3 categories and presented in order of their release within those categories, which are Ethos, Logos, and Pathos. Developed by Aristotle in rhetoric, they're generally used in terms of writing or speaking to describe persuasive strategies for appealing to an audience. Ethos involves persuasion through personal credibility and appealing to authority. Pathos involves persuasion through emotional appeals, and Logos involves persuasion through logic. While this is typically used in the context of rhetoric, obviously, I want to use it in this video to categorize the heroes based mostly on which of the 3 I think tends to influence them the most, and also maybe which one of the 3 they tend to use to influence the audience in terms of how you perceive their actions. Rarely is someone purely motivated by a single appeal, but just about everyone has a preference, consciously or not, for one of them over the others. Before we get to that, some quick channel updates. These videos were a Members' Choice Poll winner from September, which had to be delayed because I was finishing my final semester of uni. This month's winner, the right and wrong ways to use your characters, will hopefully be coming out in a couple of weeks, and while I'll probably drop the positive and negative balance topic from future polls given the lack of enthusiasm, how Overwatch's cosmetics create a culture of classism will be coming back in November, and I'm not toxic, I'm a nerd, the Liz Lemons of Overwatch will be coming back in December. If you'd like to vote in future polls, you can become a member for $5 a month by clicking the join button below. Next, there's a donathon going on Twitch right now. You can stop by to say hi, enjoy the games, or extend my suffering through subs, bits, and donations on Twitch, as well as channel memberships here on YouTube, and unlock some fun perks like bonus videos, community game nights, and more. If that sounds like your kind of thing, here's the schedule for the next week. Definitely don't look too hard at the artwork, and I'd be happy to have you come by. Finally, I've got a Discord server now. The link is in the description, and I'd love to have you there. However, just as a heads up, it is an 18+ server, and there is an age verification process for people who want to join. As I said in the first video, this is not an NSFW server, but I don't know how large it might get, and I don't want to risk creating a server that I'm unable to moderate to an appropriate extent that it would, be safe for minors to be there. If you'd like to join, link for that is also in the description. Alright, now, on to the video. Part 1. Ethos. Ethos characters are, in this context, characters who are primarily motivated by authority, either their own or that of another organization or figurehead. Ethos is generally the hardest to nail down of the 3, and it has a lot of different interpretations. For our purposes, though, I'm going to treat it as a commitment to esprit de corps, or the spirit of the group. It's a French term originally used to refer to morale of troops within a military, and for our purposes, we're going to use it to group characters together who are either primarily motivated by the interests of a group, organization, or some form of authority, either formal or informal. This might include characters who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the good of the group even if it's not purely logical, or characters who would follow orders to the end of the earth even if it goes against an emotional impulse to violate orders to either help or hurt someone. Reinhardt. There's not much to say about the Last Crusader's philosophy, honestly. He's not a super complex dude. He believes in protecting the weak and vulnerable, achieving glory, and doesn't really see Omnics as equal to humans because they're just buckets of bolts. I genuinely think if you sat Reinhardt down and asked him to explain why he believes any of those things or what makes his actions the morally correct thing to do, he'd kind of just stare at you blankly and say, "'Cause they're the right thing to do." He's not exactly a deep thinker, which is fine, although he definitely should get a little bit better about the Omnics because good god, that scene at the end of the Liberation mission is just rough. Winston. Science experiment turned scientist. It's frankly amazing that he is as optimistic as he is. Winston was raised in the Horizon lunar colony, primarily by Harold Winston, before his fellow apes rose up and slaughtered the scientists to take over the station. Winston fled to Earth and eventually joined Overwatch, an organization he was more loyal to than arguably anyone else. He saw it as a fundamental force for good in the world, and was blind not only to how it fell short, but also how it hurt others in his family, or his community at least. As Mercy put it, Winston likely never questioned why it fell apart, and couldn't see how it had damaged and changed everyone else for the worse. Part of me wants to argue that he also falls under liberalism because of his affinity to Overwatch, but I think it's more complex than that. I think his philosophy falls more under a notion of collectivism in service of unlocking humanity's potential more than anything else, and viewing Overwatch as unquestionably the best vehicle for doing so. I don't think he was unable to see that it was hard on the other agents. Rather, I think he saw himself going through all these struggles for the good of humanity and can't bring himself to analyze the organization or its activities through the lens of someone with a different philosophical stance. In other words, he just prioritized the good of the group over the good of the individuals. Zarya. Would it be a bit targeted to call the only Russian character a collectivist? Zarya was a world-renowned strongwoman who put it all on hold to join the front lines of the Omnic crisis in Russia, and since then has been staunchly committed to her service in favor of the greater good of the country. Russia fought a lot of the Omnic crisis alone, and like many Russians in the world of Overwatch, Zarya seems to take a Russia above all, everyone else second, Omnics dead last approach. Notably, when she learns of Katya's illegal dealings with the Omnics, she's persuaded to keep it secret by Katya's argument that it would hurt Russia, despite making it clear she's no longer friends with Katya. The bridge with Katya on an interpersonal level is burned, but Zarya believes that Katya's a Russian hero, and exposing the truth would hurt Russia. So, she keeps the secret. Soldier 76. Like a lot of the OG Overwatch agents, his philosophy should examine in terms of the before and after of Overwatch's fall. Before the fall, I'd argue it was mostly a general sense of altruism. He wanted to protect people and help them and was willing to put himself at risk to do so. I don't think he ever wanted to be a hero, and I think he would have been happier out of the spotlight. Like, he didn't want to be the strike commander, but he accepted the job basically just because everyone else told him he should, because he could do a lot of good. I think his general approach to liberal altruism came to an end once Overwatch fell and Reaper betrayed him. At that point, altruism's kinda out the window. He robbed a bunch of places to get some gear, and then went on the rampage as a vigilante, looking to get back at Reaper and figure out who was really behind the fall of Overwatch, because surely it couldn't have just been a flawed organization that he wasn't running very well. Does he still have a philosophical stance? I mean, I think he thinks that it's still all about the greater good, but I'd argue he's lost the plot in favor of revenge. Lucio. Alexa, play music by Madonna. Lucio's music brings the people together, mixing the bourgeoisie and the rebel to help heal the spirits of the people of Rio after the crisis. Initially just a DJ and a community organizer, he ended up becoming a more vocal, aggressive activist after Vishkar started oppressing the people of Rio. He helped lead a rebellion against the corporation, driving them out of the city using tech he'd stolen from them. Although he'd point out that they stole it from his father first and misused it, so he was really just writing wrong there. I would argue his motivations are generally closest to Zarya's as a bit of a collectivist, prioritizing the good of the people of Rio specifically and Brazil in general over any individual person. Lucio's music in particular puts him into an interesting position as well, particularly with regards to what we talked about with cultural hegemony in the first video. On the one hand, his music demonstrates clear potential as a tool for liberation to fight back against oppression from the upper class as part of the working class culture that can be rallied around. However, on the other, his alignment with Overwatch and their co-opting of his message to boost the former global hegemon's image could also be seen as an example of the way that the cultural industries that Adorno wrote about extensively water down anything potentially meaningful to the point where it just exists to make rich people richer. Adorno viewed pop music and jazz music, and I think he would probably classify Lucio's music as pop music, as being creatively bankrupt, as being inherently uncreative, as being just a repetition of the same structures over and over, watered down to make them meaningless, like I said. Then again, Adorno's opinions are famously dog shit when it comes to these topics. He's good at some other stuff, but when he's talking about pop music in particular, it kind of sounds like a weirdly Ben Shapiro-esque figure, except, you know, a Marxist. And when it comes to this side of things, I don't really think Adorno's worth listening to much in a lot of his critiques. Like I said, Lucio is kind of a collectivist in the same vein as Zarya. He prioritizes Rio specifically and Brazil in general with a focus on the poor, and will work with other people like Overwatch to achieve that. He crucially always also has the ability to pull back from Overwatch, and has proven in the past that people will follow him wherever he goes if he decides to push back against the powerful. D.Va. Gamer Girl was so good at gaming she joined the army to defend South Korea in a mech. I don't really know if there's a philosophy in that, to be honest. I don't even really know if I can call her an altruist or anything, because I don't know if she really has a philosophy on her own. She has the expectations that have been placed upon her by her country and her status of celebrity, and she admires Overwatch, but I'd argue she's kinda still growing up and figuring out her actual values and beliefs. On top of her age, she's also not really in a position to exercise much autonomy in terms of her philosophy. She's kept on a pretty tight leash by the South Korean army and basically just treated like an idol with a gun. Plus, she's just joined up with Overwatch, so who knows where things are gonna go. I think, like some heroes we're gonna talk about later, her coin's still up in the air a bit. Orisa. I mean, she's not really capable of autonomous thought herself, is she? She doesn't have sentience like Zen or Ramattra do, and her philosophy is programmed directly into her and can be affected by having different modules installed. She's the protector of Numbani, and I'd argue she's generally altruistic and self-sacrificing in that role, but that's not something she's choosing to do. It's something Efi has programmed her to do. Doomfist. Now, if you haven't watched the previous video, this is gonna come across as harsh. It might honestly come across as harsh even if you have watched the previous video, but really there's no nice way to put it. Doomfist is a social Darwinist who's at least a little bit of a fascist, particularly in terms of his leadership of Talon. As the head of the organization and the one running their ideological worldview, it's not hard to see Talon's philosophy as Doomfist. He hates the weak, believes in strengthening humanity by plunging into deadly combat to kill the weak, and is pretty unapologetic about his views on that topic. If Umberto echoes or fascism is treated like a rubric, Doomfist is probably getting at least a B- in fascism, and that is obviously not a compliment. Brigitte. Child of Torbjorn, squire of Reinhardt, and the most damaging hero to Overwatch 1's meta, it's Brigitte. Brigitte is in this category because, while she wants to do the right thing and everything, she's still ultimately following Reinhardt's lead. She's his squire, and while she'll voice her protests to many of his decisions, like attacking the dragons or rejoining Overwatch, she still follows him wherever he goes. She's generally altruistically motivated, generally wants to make the world a better place, and generally takes her position on what the right thing to do is from Reinhardt. Wrecking Ball. He's a little goober. Just a little guy. I'm not going to pretend that this rodent has a philosophy. He fled the Horizon Lunar Colony, built a gladiator mech in Junkrat and became a Fight Club champion. That's not exactly Socrates. Sojourn. While you might interpret her vigilante actions as being in tension with the way we framed Ethos here, I think it's important to remember that there's a difference between a primary motivation and a sole motivation. Sojourn's relationship to transhumanism, for starters, is a generally positive one, originally born out of survival from a childhood suffering with significant health issues, but later expanding into something she embraced as part of a means to an end, as part of a broader philosophy of servant leadership. Servant leadership is a philosophical notion towards leadership with the idea that the leader doesn't lead, they serve. They are there in service of the people that they are responsible for, whether that's a community, whether that's a corporation, whatever. While Sojourn usually does this through the framework of the law, she's willing to go beyond it if she thinks that's what's necessary to save people, particularly if she thinks the legal routes won't be fast enough or responsive enough. I'd argue that in terms of philosophy, there are few proponents of liberalism more absolute than Sojourn in the roster. Maybe Winston, but again, I think that's more about the organization than the ideology. She believes in making peace, in protecting everyone, and in expanding the Canadian version of the liberal ideal of life, liberty, and security of the person to more broadly include omnics. Her approach to artificial intelligence is also worth noting as a steadfast proponent of seeing omnics as being functionally equivalent to humans in terms of how they should be treated, as you can see in her commitment to fighting against the anti-omnic Ontario United group, as well as taking particular umbrage at Reinhardt's callousness after liberation. Kiriko, a character with a unique history that's given her a unique worldview. Kiriko exists at an intersection between tradition and modernism in terms of her connection to the fox spirit from her grandmother and her training as a fighter from her mother. Similar to Lucio, she comes from a position of, this big bad group of people is fucking up my city and I've had enough. In her case, the city is Kanazaka and the big bads are the Hashimoto who've terrorized them. Kiriko, then, could be argued to be a collectivist in the vein of Lucio and Zarya, putting the interests of her community over the interests of any individual within it. In her case specifically, that means not only being willing to form and lead the yokai, but also being willing to fight back knowing it might lead to harm to her, her mother, or her father, who's still in Hashimoto captivity. The right thing to do is to liberate Kanazaka, but she is not a utilitarian in that fight. Enacting an all-out campaign of terror in the city isn't an acceptable option to her. She frames herself as the protector of Kanazaka, which not only includes fighting its enemies, but protecting its people through the healing powers she gets from the fox spirit. She's still actively working out where she stands, so she'll probably develop further down the road, but I think that for now at least that kind of sums her up pretty well. Ramattra. Look, I've made it clear in the past why I think Overwatch's omnics are a really shitty analogy for real-world oppression. With the other omnics, there's stuff to say about them that goes beyond that, but with Ramattra, it's kind of all he is, and I think that sucks, because the analogy is bad and equating to any real-world figures is pretty much inherently in bad taste. So instead, what I want to focus on is moral relativism. Namely, the distinction he draws between what is moral and just for omnics versus humans based on their different circumstances as species. Omnics are a single-generation species. They can't reproduce in a way that would allow their sentience to continue, and if no one kills them, they can live a long-ass time. However, humanity keeps killing them, and there is no way to replace those losses. Humanity has proven unwilling or unable to do better, so Ramattra's philosophies come to revolve around the fact that humans don't understand anything except violence. So, he'll speak to them in the language they understand. He justifies his violence on the grounds that, for one, this is an asymmetrical situation. The humans are free to stop abusing omnics whenever, and if they do, he'll chill. For another, humans can reproduce. While his violence will kill individual people, and I don't think he thinks that that's like a good thing to do, I think he thinks it's a necessary cost. But his violence will never make them extinct, whereas humans' violence against omnics could make them extinct. So he's not threatening them as much as they're threatening omnics. He's come to a point where he doesn't believe humanity is capable of peaceful coexistence and wants a separate omnic homeland for them to live out their lives in security, and is basically offering humanity a choice of which cost they're willing to pay. Land or lives. Give them their land and leave them alone, or they'll keep killing people. Ramattra feels cornered by the circumstances humanity put him in. If he tries to follow the philosophies of either the Shambali or Zenyatta, he is certain that extinction is inevitable. Violence might still lead to extinction, but it also might lead to a solution. It's the only one offering any path to a future for the Omnics in his eyes, which justifies it as a course of action. Part 2. Pathos. Pathos characters are, in this interpretation, characters primarily motivated by emotion, be it sympathy, empathy, pity, pursuit of justice, honor, etc. If you wanted to be derisive, you could call this the feelings over facts group, but you could also describe them as a group who relies on their own personal judgment and gut instincts rather than abdicating responsibility for their decisions to some authority figure, or just becoming some number-crunching logical asshole. Pathos characters will refuse to follow orders if they feel it's the wrong thing to do, and are willing to recognize subjectivity in the world rather than trying to base everything in some objective, logical analysis. Tracer. The box art hero for Overwatch 1, Tracer's philosophy is guided by her general idealism. She believes that the world can be made a better place, status quo of liberalism that Overwatch was protecting was good and just, that there is a future for humans and Omnics together. While I think she'd generally be argued to be an altruist, I'd argue that it'd be more accurate to describe her guiding philosophy as something I'm going to call servant heroism, or a blend of heroic motivations and servant leadership. Like we talked about earlier, servant leadership is the notion that the ideal form of leadership is leaders as servants for the people that they lead, but Tracer places a lot more emphasis on heroic motivations and an ambition for glory than an ambition for personal authority or power. Tracer is fine not being at the top of the hierarchy so long as she's able to protect and serve the people and is able to be of service, and is willing to put herself at significant risk to do so. Another important element of servant leadership that we didn't talk about before is the idea that through service, the leader inspires others to become servant leaders as well. And in the case of Tracer, she pretty openly uses her own legacy of heroic service to inspire others to follow a similar path. I mean, her catchphrase is "the world could always use more heroes." Reaper. The edgelord himself can generally have his philosophy divided into a few different phases over the course of his life. Prior to Overwatch, I'd argue he became a fatalist, or someone who believes that people are unable to do anything beyond the actual actions they take. His time in the LAPD led him to believe he was powerless to meaningfully reduce crime because crime rates never went down in spite of his work. And his time in the army led him to believe he was powerless to end authoritarianism because every authoritarian government he toppled was just replaced by megacorporations who did the same authoritarian bullshit but with a profit motive. After joining Overwatch and becoming Blackwatch's leader, however, he became much more of a utilitarian, particularly after the attack on a Blackwatch facility that left Gerard Lacroix severely wounded and killed many of the base's staff. Reaper believed that Overwatch had a duty to achieve justice and eliminate evil, and that it was better to act outside the law or the rules governing Overwatch if it meant eliminating that evil, as seen in the Retribution mission with the assassination of Antonio. After the fall of Overwatch, however, his utilitarianism shifted in favor of a more generalized, pessimistic, individualist consequentialism. Nothing else seems to get better no matter what he does, so he abandons the notion of the greater good in favor of just pursuing his own form of justice against people he felt wronged him. He joins up with Talon because they offer him an opportunity to eliminate the current fundamentally flawed status quo, which I'd argue comes from pessimism because he doesn't really seem to care what the new world order will be, only that the current world order is the worst of all possible options, so any change is inevitably going to be for the better. Pharah. An altruist through and through, Pharah believes that the morality of a given action is dependent on the outcomes of that action being more positive than negative for everyone except herself. While I'd argue that she was initially motivated a bit more by being a hero and was kind of a utilitarian in the field who viewed achieving the mission as the primary categorical imperative, her position shifts at the end of mission statement where she reflects on her Ujat tattoo as a symbol of the protector of others, not as a symbol that she was being protected. Now, her end goal is keeping the people around her safe and alive, even if it means rejecting her own personal best interests or the mission. Hanzo. The scion-turned-scoundrel, one half of Whole, and the man who killed his brother for honor and now kills other people to redeem his honor from killing his brother. It's Hanzo. Hanzo's personal philosophy is based around his honor, initially through the context of the Code of Honor of the Symmetra clan. This Code of Honor was what led the elders of the clan to push him to straighten out Genji, who wasn't following it and refused to start now, requiring Hanzo to kill him. You could argue that, up until this point, Hanzo was a moral absolutist using the clan's code as the guide for what is or is not moral. However, after Genji's death, his moral absolutism shifts into more of a "I will kill bad people if I have to atone for the murder of my brother" type of thing. He abandons the clan, believing their code of honor to be unworthy of following, and ultimately the clan collapses. Honor, to Hanzo, is a categorical imperative, something that is a self-justifying end. As Kant would put it, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, don't do something unless you're willing to not only assume it's moral when you do it, but enforce it as a moral act, a universal law for everyone. If you're acting honorably, whatever that means to Hanzo these days, then you're acting morally, and through honor, you achieve redemption. Zenyatta. I mean, it's right there in the name. Zen. Zen is a school of Buddhism that focuses on self-restraint, meditation practice, the insights that those two things provide into the nature of mind and things, and then injecting those insights into daily life. Go take a look through his voice lines for proof of this. You know, you've got, "Do I think? Does a submarine swim?" Or, "If you do not change where you're going, you may end up where you're headed." Or, "If you do not bend, you will break." Given that the Shambhali take a lot of influences from Buddhism, it makes sense that Zenyatta would have a philosophy that connects to a Buddhist school. However, he goes beyond that a little bit. Zen's whole deal pretty heavily revolves around yin and yang, the concept of opposite concepts being fundamentally intertwined. While Zenyatta's behavior and his narrative purpose, his narrative role represents more of a Zen philosophy, his kit in-game leans a lot more into that yin and yang dualism, most notably in the Harmony and Discord orbs. There's even a spray with the orbs presented as a Taijutsu, which is the symbol that you probably recognize when you think of, yin and yang. He's not a pure pacifist in sight of how he's perceived, and basically just recognizes that the ideal is not the real. It would be nice if evil could be eliminated while preserving free will, and it would be nice if violence was never the solution, and it would be nice if humanity could simply see the truth of the iris. But the reality is that it's just not how things work. It's also important to recognize that Zenyatta takes a different stance on the philosophy of Omnic liberation compared to both Null Sector and the Shambali. Namely, that the path to liberation for the Omnics and peaceful coexistence with humanity won't come from spiritual alignment or from enacting violence until oppression is too costly, but instead from making interpersonal connections with humanity. I don't really know if there's a term for the idea of a non-human relying on socializing humans into tolerance, but if there is, that's what he's up to. Cassidy. The cowboy's philosophy is, well, it's kind of hard to nail down. I would argue that his philosophy is basically just a minute-to-minute evaluation of what suits him best at any given time, not really a super coherent philosophical stance on the world. He's a, I'll know what's moral when I see it, kind of moral relativist. Generally, he's on the side of justice and wants to atone for his past behavior, but he does draw some weird lines in the sand over stuff like the execution of Antonio versus the countless people he's killed over the years. He does still draw those lines, though. Unlike Reaper and Moira, for example, he never went to Talon after Overwatch fell. Honestly, I think he just trusts his gut and his intuition about what's right and what's wrong, and is doing his best to be a good person. I wish I could tie it into some more grand philosophical position, but he's just doing his own thing. Roadhog. Hates Omnics. Hates people too, but in a different way. Might makes right, and he is strong as fuck. That's really all I can say about his philosophical stance, and I think you'd be angry at the idea of anyone thinking too much more about it. Genji. Much like Hanzo, honor is the primary motivator here. However, the journey is certainly a little bit different. Genji was a troublemaker as a kid and didn't follow in the ways of the Shimada clan, and it eventually led to his near death at the hands of Hanzo. His relationship with transhumanism is, to put it mildly, contentious. He hated the cybernetic enhancements he'd been given for a long time, and any ethical or moral standards he once held were clouded by anger throughout his time with Overwatch. After Overwatch fell, he eventually found his way to Zenyatta, who helped him find inner peace with his transhumanism. Genji's philosophy still revolves around honor and redemption, much like Hanzo's, but with the crucial distinction that Genji has found the redemption he was looking for. Instead of looking for personal redemption now, he is looking to do good for the world as a bit more of a general all-purpose altruist, with a little bit of Zen's, Zen-ness in there too. Ana. A lifetime of service for a range of different causes has involved Ana's philosophy changing over the years, but one thing I'd argue remains true is her belief in utilitarianism, but not in the way it's generally invoked. People generally see utilitarians as cold, emotionless people who focus on heartlessly crunching the numbers, but I think Ana represents a more empathetic version of this, particularly in her approach as a sniper. If she was going to shoot, she was going to shoot to kill rather than to wound because she wanted to minimize her target's personal suffering. When Widowmaker shot her, she thought that letting everyone believe she had died would cause the least possible suffering, a decision she later came to regret not because she thought it was the wrong thing to do on an inherent level, but because she realized that letting Pharah believe she was dead had caused more harm than good. When she thought the best she had to offer was her ability to kill, she prioritized doing that perfectly over everything else. But once she realized she could potentially do more good for more people as a healer, she embraced the biotic rifle and her ability to heal allies from range as well as non-lethally attack enemies. She's certainly not a pacifist, not now and not ever, but her kit reflects a preference for far less lethal practices than before. Sleep Dart incapacitates an enemy mostly harmlessly, while her biotic rifle is incapable of landing headshots on enemies the way she once did. She sees herself as a soldier more than anything, and a soldier, quote, isn't meant to change the world just to save it. That's also reflected in how, when deciding whether or not to intervene in Talon's attack on Temple of Anubis, she prioritized the innocent people caught in the crossfire, rather than fighting Talon or staying out of it like Soldier or Mercy respectively. Baptiste. Overwatch's bisexual icon has a complicated worldview, made complicated by his circumstances in life. For one, Bap's Haitian, and it doesn't go without notice that Overwatch, the global liberal hegemon, generally seemed uninterested in helping Haiti. If you know much about Haiti, you'll know that this is par for the course for the country, which has spent the last few centuries being penalized for daring to overthrow the European enslavers who had colonized it. Haiti's poverty and lack of support from outside has led many to desperation, particularly through tragedies, be they natural or conflict-based. Baptiste lived a kill-or-be-killed life in the aftermath of the crisis and was willing to work with whoever would give him a leg up. That meant initially joining with the Caribbean Coalition when Overwatch didn't show up, and later meant joining up with Talon under the promise they'd make him rich enough to make a better life for himself and his people. However, it's important to recognize that once Baptiste's immediate survival needs were being met, he had the freedom to actually reevaluate his past philosophy. Dog eat dog is survival, not sustainability, and like many people who survive desperate circumstances, he needed to no longer be in those desperate circumstances in order to develop a more robust collective worldview. Once he was no longer in a position where ethical egoism was the only way to justify what needed to be done to survive, he dropped it and developed a more altruistic worldview. He reoriented himself around his original goal, helping people as a medic, and left Talon at considerable danger to himself to do so. I'd also be remiss if I didn't at least mention Mauga here, since he'll be joining the game soon and they're literally ex-boyfriends according to the people who've been writing their stories argue with the wall. Mauga stuck around with Talon after Baptiste left, and in an argument, Baptiste and Mauga's worldviews became clear. Baptiste was willing to delude himself into believing Talon was on the up and up because he needed to for his own sake, to stay within his moral compass, but eventually his altruism was able to overpower the survival philosophy he'd held onto, and he was forced to confront the reality. Mauga, by contrast, was under no such delusion. He sees Baptiste as naive for ever believing that Talon was actually doing the right thing. Mauga's belief is pretty explicitly stated when he says, "There are no good people. Not you, not me. All we can do is have a bit of fun while we've got the chance." Mauga is pulling a little bit from nihilism and fatalism, but primarily from hedonism with this. Nothing matters, nothing gets better, let's just do what we need to do to enjoy whatever pleasures we can find. Crucially though, Mauga doesn't endorse Talon's social Darwinism or their fascism. He's with Talon because they offer him the good life, not because he cares for their vision of the future. Baptiste, on the other hand, does see the potential for a better future, and this is core to his disagreement with Mauga. Talon will make the world worse, and that's not something he'll stand for even if he stands to personally gain. It's an interesting philosophical conflict between the two, especially given their history together and what it'll mean for them now that Baptiste with Overwatch and Mauga is with Talon. Junker Queen. So, remember in the last video when I said that the Junkers and ALF represented the answer to the question, what if all you knew about Australia was Pauline Hanson and Mad Max? Well, she's Mad Max Pauline Hanson. Raised by former ALF fighters in the post-apocalyptic outback, she is uncompromising in her xenophobia, unrelenting in her support for brutal corporal punishment, and a strong believer that Australia belongs to her and her people alone. Very much so, not the Omnics. She's also a bit of a social Darwinist, openly stating that there are no rules, no mercy, only the strong survive in her Junkertown, and believes in retributive justice as seen in her decision to banish Mason Howell after defeating him as he had done to her and her family when she was a child. Lifeweaver. A devout proponent of the school of Jada Essence Hall, he spreads the essence of beauty wherever he goes. Lifeweaver being hot isn't just fan service, even if it's also fan service. It also reflects part of his philosophical stance. He believes in protecting beauty as a component of the world. Be that in protecting the beauty of nature, the beauty of humans, or the beauty of life itself. His worldview revolves around the idea that it's the right thing to do when it comes to protecting the environment, and that can't be done through existing structures and systems that are in place. In that sense, we might make a distinction between himself and someone like May, and establish him as a believer in ecologism rather than environmentalism, which focuses more specifically on humanity's relationship to nature as well as the belief that there needs to be a dramatic change in order to protect the environment long term. He follows a path of moral absolutism in his own way, drawing lines in the sand that he believes should not be crossed, even if those lines don't adhere to the law, or adhere to Vishkar's lines in the sand, which he happily crossed. I don't know if you could argue that he's a socialist or anything like that, but he is certainly anti-capitalist. His biolite technology could have easily made him a fortune, and he likely would have had immense success if he'd stuck it out at Vishkar, but instead he chose to do what he saw as right for the planet rather than for himself, and honestly it only makes him hotter. Illari. Overwatch's newest hero, and the one arguably least connected to anything else established in the universe of Overwatch, which makes it a little bit hard to figure out her deal. Illari is the last of the Inti Warriors, a group that was, kind of at an interesting intersection of traditionalism and transhumanism. Her philosophy, in so much as she has one, revolves around taking the blame for the accident and seeking atonement for it. So I guess you could compare her philosophy to someone like Hanzo, but honestly, so little has been seen from her that I'd say that her coin is still in the air too. It's too soon to tell with her. Part 3. Logos. Logos characters are, in this interpretation, characters who base their motivations in logical deductions. While that might seem like the most subjective motivation of the three, it's important to remember that the question of what is logical is pretty subjective. Is it logical to kill an enemy so they can't come back in the future? Is it more logical to leave them alive? Are there absolutes in that, or is it contextual? Logos tends to be associated with philosophical stances like utilitarianism, but it can take a lot of different forms based on what a character perceives to be logically consistent regardless of appeals from emotion or authority. Widowmaker. Now, during the intro when I said that some characters don't really have a philosophy because of a lack of agency, this is probably who first sprung to mind for you. And you're right. Widowmaker is, in theory, literally incapable of autonomous independent thoughts and feelings due to her brainwashing. I'd argue that's a bit of an overstatement given that she's clearly capable of experiencing and expressing disdain, anger, or satisfaction as seen in the cinematics and in-game interactions, so she does clearly clear the bar of I think therefore I am, but that's really about it. She's guided by the logic that she exists to serve the people who control her, and in that sense kind of by their philosophies. Her disdain comes from her perception that others will get in the way of her service. Her anger comes from her frustration at failing to achieve the objectives they set for her, and her satisfaction comes from achieving those objectives. An interesting character concept? Sure, but in terms of any sort of personal philosophy, I don't think there's that much to say. Mercy. The medic with morals. Mercy is a genius when it comes to medical technology, but is a staunch moral absolutist. Some things are off limits in medicine no matter what results it might yield. That doesn't necessarily mean she conforms to the morals of society in general, given that I'm pretty sure plenty of people would question the morality of developing technology to resurrect the dead, but she generally has hard and fast rules about what constitutes ethical medical practices regardless of context. She has particular beef with Moira over this, and is taking the stance that it's better to maintain those ethical standards than to behave unethically, even if the outcome could be a net positive. This also goes in the other direction too. She will provide medical service in places like Cairo regardless of whether or not the people wanted her there after the harm Overwatch had committed. However, her moral absolutism also does not preclude her from working with people or organizations she finds unethical if it means she can help more people. She didn't love Overwatch's militarism and is herself generally a pacifist. I mean, she is Swiss, but was willing to join Overwatch in spite of that because it offered a greater opportunity to help more people. However, once the militarism outweighed the good she felt she could do, she left and went to find other ways to help. Torbjorn. Probably one of the more interesting heroes in terms of his philosophy towards technology, honestly. He's an engineering genius, primarily with weapon systems, but also believes that technology was something fundamentally to be used by and in service of humans, not artificial intelligence. His philosophy on AI was simple. He didn't trust it because he could not predict how it would make decisions. AI does not necessarily have the same motives or incentives or whatever else that a human does. You can maybe sometimes at least try to predict how a human will behave because you know the things that will be weighing on them, the morality, the structures that they live under. You don't know that with AI. The subject is obviously pretty topical right now, and Torb's approach to it was deeply pessimistic. He was confident that it could get out of control, and he wasn't sure he could trust his judgment. The philosophy surrounding AI is complicated for a lot of reasons, and for Torb's purposes, the complications come from the fact that autonomous artificial intelligence is going to have different incentives and motivations than humans would, and that will make them unpredictable to us. And you don't want to give all your guns to unpredictable things that might suddenly start crunching the numbers and deciding it's better off with you dead. I think some people might assume Torbjorn's philosophy is more on par with someone like Ryan, but I'd argue it actually goes far, far deeper. He not only has a strong philosophical stance, but also seems to believe it as a fundamentally human one. He's a humanist. He believes that morality devolves or derives from humanity itself, that human values, human principles, human reason, that is the core of morality. He's pretty pessimistic about the Omnics and seems less concerned with whether they theoretically could achieve a similar level of competent sentience and more about the likelihood of their sentience leading them to acting in their own self-interest, and that self-interest being opposite to humanity's. Over time, though, his views have shifted and been softened a little bit, most notably after his adoption of Bastion, which lowered his guard a bit and made him see some of the nuances of the situation, as opposed to just writing off all Omnics as fundamentally dangerous. Bastion. Beep boop. He's just Bastion. He was programmed as a murder bot, hijacked into becoming a murder bot against targets he wasn't supposed to, and then his programming collapsed, and it seems like now he's mostly sentient. But also it kind of seems like he's just profoundly amnesiac with occasional war flashbacks. I really don't think I could argue that he has much of a philosophy, to be honest. Symmetra. Gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. I'm just kidding, she's a technocratic secular utilitarian. She believes that order is good, chaos is bad, and anything that brings order to a place that was once chaotic is a good thing, and she believes that the tech bros at Vishkar know what's up and are morally correct in exerting their authority because of their expertise. Meanwhile, if the iris is real, it can prove itself in a scientifically quantifiable way, or it can be discarded until it can be proven. At least that's how she used to be. Seeing how Vishkar behaved in Rio and later in Suravasa has led her to develop more of a nuanced worldview. Her friendship with Zenyatta as well as her history with Lifeweaver have forced her to reevaluate her philosophical stance too. Her moral absolutism has wavered over time, but her coin is still in the air for now. She's still finding her footing. Junkrat. He's a Weasley little guy, always out to make a buck. Implying he has a philosophy would imply there's something governing right and wrong on a moral level for him, and I honestly don't think he cares about that. He's motivated by treasure and wealth and has no regard for who it belongs to or whether it's okay to take it, only whether he can steal it. The problem with calling him an objectivist or an ethical egoist is that while both of those would reflect his general prioritization of self-interest over literally anything and everything else, I don't think he cares enough to justify his behavior enough for it. An ethical egoist needs to believe that acting in self-interest is ethical, and an objectivist needs to similarly believe that acting in self-interest is moral, and I don't think Junkrat cares enough about perceiving his own actions through that framework. He acts in self-interest because he wants to, not because he thinks it's ethical or moral, nor does he feel the need to justify it that way. May. An environmentalist and rationalist as well as a bit of a perpetual optimist. Environmentalism focuses on protecting, restoring, and improving the natural environment, and for May that generally takes the form of a climatology. Rationalism is the belief that reason is the primary source and verifier of knowledge, generally a pretty logical one that opposes emotion. Scientists in general are usually rationalists with a pretty strong disdain for anti-intellectualism, but that is particularly true of climate scientists, something you can definitely see reflected in May's worldview. I think people might be surprised to see her in the Logos camp rather than Pathos given her personality, but I think part of what makes her interesting is that it's a bit of a chicken and the egg type situation with her. She sees the climate as a logical problem that has logical solutions, and so is motivated to do the research to prove not only the problem, but the solution, and finds it deeply frustrating when other people reject logic. However, she's also motivated to do so by the desire to help people. She wants to protect at-risk people, places, and animals from climate change, and especially after losing all her colleagues in Antarctica, seems to almost have a personal beef with climate change as a concept for killing her friends. Personal philosophies and motivations are complex, and for May, like a lot of people in her profession, you can really see how logic and emotion serve as complementary motivations rather than opposing ones. Sombra. One of countless orphans of the Omnic crisis, she was a natural with computers from the jump and began quickly working with Los Muertos as a child. Sombra comes from similar circumstances to Baptiste in a lot of ways, and they are friends, and her philosophy was generally a lot more survival-oriented to start. Knowledge is power, and as someone who had once been powerless, she was starving for more of it. She became, according to at least the wiki, addicted to seeking out information. Her philosophy shifted hard once she got found out. She stumbled upon a global conspiracy, and that conspiracy stumbled upon her, forcing her to delete her old self and become Sombra. She embraced transhumanism through aggressive augmentations as well as a single-minded philosophy of whatever I need to do to figure out who's behind all of this is justified. To that end, she's been willing to hack anyone, kill anyone, and work with anyone to get closer to it. However, while it might seem like utilitarianism taken to the extreme, I'd argue it's a bit more complicated. Remember, Sombra was an orphan at the crisis and watched as she and countless others were effectively discarded while the rich and powerful got richer and more powerful. A lot of her philosophy stems from the desire to hold people accountable for what happened. Who can be held responsible for her parents' death? Who can be held responsible for the poverty and the power grabs that happened after the crisis? There's a certain level of populism in Sombra's philosophy, and her goal with targeting a conspiracy seems to be to expose it and hold them accountable like what happened with Widow. Somebody is behind all the violence and suffering, and she wants to put an end to it. Again, she views unmasking the conspiracy as a categorical imperative to such an extent that all actions in pursuit of that goal are acceptable to her, whether that's murder or just working with fascists-like talent to get to where she needs to get. Moira. A geneticist with a penchant for moral and ethical skepticism, Moira believes in nothing over results. You might find it weird to describe her as a collectivist, given that her disregard for others in favor of scientific pursuits might inspire thoughts of the scientists in Bioshock's objectivist rapture, but Moira does still prioritize the greater good of humanity, at least in her own mind, with a key example being her willingness to use not just others, but also herself as a test subject. She also follows the principle of utilitarian bioethics, believing that decisions in biology and medicine are good if they are the choices that make the most people happy, even if it requires some suffering. A philosophy that is controversial, to put it mildly, given the stakes involved in medicine. She is aggressively libertarian with a staunch opposition to anyone who tries to regulate her practices or even simply impose any concept of ethics or morality onto her. Moira believes humanity is on the cusp of an evolutionary breakthrough, but that it's getting in its own way. And, in the words of Moira, the breakthrough can only be found by delving deeper into those areas forbidden by law, by morality, and by fear. Moira will work with whoever will fund her research and not bother her with restrictions, leading her to become the Minister of Genetics at Oasis, a group of technocrats with a libertarian approach to scientific research, as well as a member of Talon's inner council. If it seems a little strange for an unethical scientist to find her home among the fascists, I would remind you that the entire history of fascism is littered with Moira Odeoranes. Ashe. Alexa, play Rich Girl by Hall & Oates. True gaslight gatekeep girl boss energy from her, and I'm not just joking about it like I was with Sim. She's an ethical egoist. And again, to be clear, that doesn't mean she's being ethical about her egoism. She's gonna do what's right for her, and if it's what's best for her, then it was the right thing to do. It was the ethical thing to do. You could also argue she's an objectivist, but I think ethical egoist works best. Raised as a rich kid by neglectful parents, or rather by her Omnic butler, she's learned that she is the only one looking out for her, so she doesn't owe anything to anyone else. Sigma. Look, I'm sure the dude had a philosophy before his brain got melted by gravity or whatever, but now he's got nothing but symphonies between his ears. Echo. Is it even possible for Echo to have a philosophy of her own? She is literally just built to be a reflection of the people around her. Maybe down the road she can evolve to an extent where you could argue that she is autonomously choosing a philosophy to follow, but she is still just following her programming as of right now. Honestly, it feels kind of anticlimactic to end on a hero without really saying much about her, but what else is there to say about the philosophy of someone who's specifically built to prevent them from actually developing autonomous sentience? Anyways, with that, that's where we're going to end it. Can you believe that I initially planned for this video to be the shorter of the two? If you've enjoyed the rambling though, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and to check out part 1 if you haven't already. Before I go, be sure to come and say hi on Twitch. I'll be continuing with the Donathon for a little while longer, so I'm live most days, and if you'd like to prolong the Donathon and get to vote in the next Member's Choice poll, you can do so by getting a channel membership for $5 by clicking the join button below. Thank you very much to all my channel members. Mini Q, Olesp, Cage the Orc, The Afro of Doom, Nballs, Fish Toast, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Popsnack, Connor, Circo, Yoshi of the Wire, It's Peggy VTW, Remy, Catlover192, Sourdough, Luma Riley, Venus, Monkey12 Ninja, Cadence, and Damn. If you stuck around to the end, thank you very much for watching. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or you just stopped by to watch a video, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you around again soon.